Hi everyone, Jake Bonetta here. I just wanted to do a little aside to you before we get started quickly. You may notice throughout this episode that my sound quality is slightly worse than usual. It's got quite a lot of gain and is quite loud. I'm not sure why this recording has ended up like this, and I've tried everything I can to fix it, including re-recording some sections, so hopefully it isn't too bad for you. But I want to apologise, as it's not up to the standards I like to keep to personally. However, I do still think you will enjoy this episode on designer babies. I know I did. It was fun to record. So, without further ado, let's run the intro music. Hello, and welcome to Fixing Ignorance, a new podcast opening conversation on the big political, psychological, and philosophical questions of our time. My name is Jake Bonetta, and I will be the host of this podcast series. Each episode, I will be joined by a few guests, my friends and colleagues, talking about facts and our opinions on massive, serious, and thought-provoking issues in a more relaxed setting than a debate. Today, we will be talking about designer babies, specifically whether designer babies are a good idea or not. However, before we get started on that, I am joined today by Ian Taylor, Guy Round, Amber Hill, and Pierre Hasham. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about you?
Hello, my name is Ian Taylor. I studied English literature, psychology, and drama, and my most interest is writing.
Hey, I'm Guy. I study politics, psychology, and law, and I'm looking to study psychology at university next year, hopefully going on to become a therapist or some other such similar role.
Hi, I'm Amber. I studied biology, chemistry, and physics at school, and hopefully I'll be studying veterinary medicine at uni, and I'm quite interested in exotic animals and advanced surgery.
Hi, my name's Pierre. I study computer science, math, and physics with a bit of further maths, and I am looking to become a robotics engineer at Bath University.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, guys. So, designer babies are babies whose genetic makeups have been selected or altered for various reasons, such as to remove a gene that codes for a specific disease or insert a gene for a specific attribute or trait. The process of selecting specific embryos through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, is one of the main stages of modern IVF pregnancies, a relatively common procedure in the Western world. In fact, since the first IVF birth in 1978 of Louise Brown, there have been an estimated 8 million children born through this process, with around 20,000 children born through IVF in the UK alone each year. That's approximately 2% of births. However, the idea of editing the basic makeup of a human, the DNA, has been a massively controversial idea by all accounts. Scientifically, there seems to be many positives to the idea of genetic engineering and editing. So, guys, what do you think are the benefits of designer babies? Guy?
Okay, so, you already touched on PGD. There's a similar idea, at least, or similar procedure, which is currently being worked on. I think it's called CRISPR-Cas9. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. But essentially, that one similarly uses natural enzymes to eliminate mutant genes. It's far from perfect, but it's in the works. And it basically follows the same idea that we're looking to and we're aiming to try and eliminate mutant genes, just generally diminish the chances of a child having some genetic or hereditary disease or disability. And this, I wanted to talk briefly about ethics. So you can justify this under Kantian ethics. So Kantian ethics is essentially the idea that all human beings should be treated never as a means to an end, but always as an end themselves. And if you follow this while you're applying something like genetic engineering, designer babies, that kind of thing, you can essentially justify the elements of designer babies provided they're for the child's sake. So again, prevention or just generally reducing the chances of a genetic or hereditary disease. So things like CRISPR, things like PGD. So not like going off the extremes into reaching a point where you're changing the child because it's what you personally want. As long as you're acting in their own interests, you can definitely ethically justify it. The only issue there is, of course, in a practical sense, it's difficult to draw a line of where you're actually acting in the child's interest and where you're acting in your interest.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point, actually, talking about Kantian ethics, because that all revolves around the duty of a person to be truthful, the duty of a person to be kind. So I think that links quite heavily into the idea of genetic engineering. If you're trying to be kind to a person, surely you would want to help them out by genetically engineering them to, say, eradicate a certain disability. Pierre, did you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, I feel like scientifically it is also something that's a must, because with natural selection and just the fact of evolving in general, it's just another means to do so in a faster way. And we should be doing it, really, because evolving is going to happen anyway, but we've sort of slowed the process amongst human beings with basic medication. But if we have designer babies, we could further the human evolving, and evolutionary traits would become superior to previous human beings, as it should be.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually. The evolution of humans is a major part of a society, or a major part of any creature or being, really. Ian, did you have anything to say?
I feel as though it's a kindness because, as Pierre rightly said, it's speeding up evolution. And the problem with evolution, there's always the off chance that some people will be born at an evolutionary disadvantage. And I think to remove that evolutionary disadvantage creates a huge sense of equality, particularly if you ignore traits such as, for example, looks. A lot of people will want to influence news like that, but you can't stop that personally. I would say that there'd be a lot of people that would abuse the power of designer babies to, as Guy rightly said, create idealistic children for their own benefit. But I think on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you are still going towards the child's benefit, even if there's a little bit of that influence from the parents, it is still helping them be the best the child can be.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point that you make there, Ian. The idea that a parent is trying to help their child by giving them better genes. It seems like, to me at least, a more advanced idea of like helping them through school or helping them in life with learning or anything. Surely you'd want to speed up that process for your child by being compassionate and ingraining it into their DNA before they're born. Amber.
So it could be argued that with parents bringing up their child, because of how they will try to influence them to go into a certain thing. So, for example, if they want them to be into music or to be into sports, and they will influence that. So some people could say that if a parent does want to genetically edit their child, that's almost the same sort of thing as raising them up to be a certain way.
Yeah, obviously, genetic engineering pretty much affects everything about a person's life, because at the end of the day, you can pretty much whittle down a person to the programming that is in their genes. So, yeah, it's a very interesting thing to think about. Guy, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so in terms of like what Pierre and Ian were kind of saying in regards to like it being something that is a kindness, something that people should do, there's a medical principle of a child's right to an open future. It's kind of very important in terms of medical ethics. And while it can be used both for and against, I want to use it for here for a moment, which is one could argue that a doctor knowingly doing nothing to prevent something that they could prevent, and in that case it could be a debilitating disability, surely that is denying that child the right to an open future. And in a similar regard, I think we would agree that if there is let's say there's a mother, right, and the mother has Munchausen by proxy, which is essentially when they might deliberately cause or exacerbate a medical or generally just an issue for their child. It's a mental problem. But essentially, it is entirely plausible that a mother could, in a world of designer babies, see that their child has the possibility of having like a really serious condition, let's say transposition of the great arteries, which would require like several surgeries. It's just really life-changing stuff. They could choose for their child to have that, or in the same way, I think most people would agree that by taking no action when they could, quote unquote, save their child from that, that is awful, right? That's really they are knowingly choosing for their child to have something which might just, I mean, it might instantly kill that child. It might, like, you don't know what's going to happen. It's really serious. So if we can agree that inaction there is wrong, then surely we agree that it is justifiable to give that child, again, more of an open future. And in that regard, we could even see a point where doctors or the government as a whole have to step in and go, no, you cannot choose that child. That child's embryo has this thing, which is like not blacklisted, but essentially just while I'm not looking for too much government intervention, which is something I'll probably raise in the against area, essentially, if we are following medical principles and medical ethics, we should agree that it would not be okay to simply let a child suffer.
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to think about, the ethics behind designer babies especially. I completely agree with you, Guy. There is a slippery slope as to where the decisions lie in certain embryos being born or inserted into the woman for IVF births. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that we should look into further in a second. Pierre, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I feel like the economy as well would sort of greatly benefit if we did have designer babies. So all economies would have to spend less on certain medical issues and diseases like Huntington's disease and things, which are quite expensive treatments or just quite expensive on the economy in general. Because if they no longer have that, then the money can be spent on further research into genetics as it is. And with research and genetics, design babies would also benefit that already. So it's like a double-edged sword, but in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. Economically, there is an argument to try and cure such diseases, especially if you look at places like America, where there is a heavy influence on the market by the health insurance companies, where there is no national health service except for in some states. So the health insurance economy is very, very important over there. Less so in the UK with a national health system, but you can definitely see where that argument could end up. Ian, did you have anything to say?
I was also saying that more often than not, when a baby may be born with a defect, mothers often will be given only two options, and that will be keep the baby and watch it suffer, or terminate the baby and get an abortion. And by granting a third option of genetically altering the baby, it's arguably great for mental health, because the only thing you edit is that a baby does not have terminal illness when it is born. That is frankly just an amazing, amazing scientific discovery that we can change those factors about our kids. And you might get maybe kids with fibromyalgia or more affecting physical disabilities that limit them, perhaps paraplegism and all the lot. And I think that being able to limit that is amazing, frankly. And I think it definitely should be available to anyone who chooses to do so.
Okay, yeah, absolutely, Ian. I think that given the choice, mothers would and should choose to get rid of a disability in a child. At the end of the day, is it right to knowingly give birth to a disabled child when you absolutely have the option to go through and edit their genes through, as Guy said earlier, CRISPR, to enable them to live a more prosperous and long life? Amber, did you have anything to add?
I think this might sound like a slightly out there thought, but say in a future with the effect of climate change, meaning that humans will have to adapt a bit more, perhaps genetically modifying us could help with that. So, for example, if there just wasn't any space and something as ridiculous as we need to learn how to live underwater, maybe genetic modification could help with some unusual way to do that. So it could be that with whatever happens in the future, this is what's going to allow a race to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Amber. I think that global warming is obviously pretty much at the top of the global agenda at the moment. And if we don't do something to solve it or to fix it, we need to have some ideas there of what we can do to help ourselves. So I think genetic editing is actually a very good route and very interesting route that we could go down in that respect. Okay, I think we should move on now to the other side of the argument. What do you think are the negatives of designer babies?
Yeah, so just kind of briefly going back to, for all the reasons I justified it ethically, so things like a child's right to an open future and Kantian ethics, at the same time, that's justified only to a limited extent. So once you get to a certain point of customizing, for want of a better word, you transcend the idea that you're acting for the child's sake, and you begin to act for your own sake. So if you're choosing and sculpting who you want your child to be from a genetic point of view, something that they don't really have much control over, genotype's only really controlled by phenotype, and phenotype isn't necessarily in the child's control. That does not fly under Kantian ethics. And similarly, if you as a parent choose, I want my child to have this gene which is shown in combination with this gene to make this arm stronger, and this will be better for when I want them to play tennis or whatever. I don't think that's actually how it works, but that kind of thing. Again, you're actually, instead of giving your child a greater right to an open future, and instead of just making their future more open by eliminating things which would hold them back, you're instead actually specifically pigeonholing them into something specific that you want, which I don't think is ethically or morally justifiable.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Guy. I think the idea that changing the DNA of someone without their consent, especially because they haven't been born, does raise some very important ethical questions that need to be addressed. But I think another good way of looking at it is if we jump over the pond to America. Obviously, America is a majority religious society, very, very Christian. So their opinions on the matter can be quite interesting. There was a poll done by the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University of 1,000 US adults in 2016, and it found that 65% of these people think that changing the genes of unborn babies to reduce their risk of developing certain diseases, not character traits, diseases, should be illegal. That's a very important and poignant point to make, especially in such a forward-looking society. Amber, did you have anything to add to this?
So it could be argued that genetically engineering babies could contribute to the socioeconomic divisions we already have in society, because this process would be incredibly expensive. I think that in America it costs about $20,000 to have IVF in the first place, and to be genetically tested it's about $10,000. And so if the richest division of our world all had genetic engineering to create babies that were incredibly clever, incredibly good at sports, music, anything like that, then it will just create a bigger divide, because the poorer people won't be able to afford that, and so their children won't be as good as all these things that they've created. And so as a result, the seemingly better people will get the better jobs, and everyone else won't be able to go up in the world in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. There is the massive possibility of creating a huge gap in society between the so-called designed people and the so-called undesigned people, the quote-unquote imperfect people in society. Much akin to what society could have been like in the 1700s or the 1800s, with the aristocracy and the political class being in quite a lot of control. So it's definitely a very big ethical issue to look at the cost of said treatments and whether they should become mainstream or not, or just kept to the rich. Guy, did you have anything to say?
Yeah, so I just want to say, while we're talking about aspects of genetic engineering and design of babies, which aren't necessarily in terms of is it ethically a good idea, but more so in terms of in practice in the society that we live in, would this actually work or would this be bad? I wanted to kind of loop back to the idea. So in the 1920s and 1930s, as most people hopefully know, eugenics as a concept was kind of sweeping the world. A lot of people don't know that Winston Churchill was on the first ever. He was, I think, the vice president of the first ever council for eugenics. So it was a massive idea. But the issue with it, and I'm not trying to get full on libertarian, don't step on me here. But essentially, the issue with it is that if you give the government and the state too much control to, medically influence people because they've decided, oh, this thing is okay, this thing isn't okay, it gets quite a slippery slope. So while I personally would actually like it if doctors were the ones who made the ultimate decision of, hey, okay, your child might have this, while you have a say in this, I'm sorry, but I cannot, with good conscience, let you choose this to be your child when there is a perfectly, like, there's an embryo which doesn't have this condition, which will mean that your child's life is essentially just permanent pain for, 2 years. But at the same time, the issue with that is, if we look back at times like eugenics, you have these incredibly, incredibly, incredibly vague definitions of what is and isn't grounds. So I can't remember exactly what it is, which is unfortunate, but there's a quote about diagnosing someone with, I think it's feeble-mindedness from the 20s. And it's essentially the idea that if they can't, and again, it's incredibly broad, incredibly versatile for how you want to describe it. If they can't function adequately in proper society, and etc. etc. So basically, just if the government chooses not to like you, so a lot of gay people, for example, were classified under this. And by 1930, 41 US states had restricted the marriage rights of people who were legally deemed feeble-minded. So while, again, that's a different time, that doesn't necessarily change the fact that I would hope that it would still be, the doctors would have the ability to step in. At the same time, it is worrying, and you have to be sure not to give the government too much control. Otherwise, I feel like we could easily just enter a situation where it gets dodgy. And that's when I'm talking here, I'm talking about the UK government, let alone governments that already exist, which are significantly more dictator-like. But in terms of if North Korea, if current China had access to these kinds of things, it could lead to, your child, children of Uyghurs, for example. I hope I pronounced that right. Very difficult word to say. In current China, where there is a literal genocide happening, there could be a lot more quote unquote subtle genocides of it just so happens that people of this religious following or this ethnicity just happen to have this gene we found, which we paid this doctor enough to say, oh yeah, we think that's linked to cancer or something. So sorry, but you just can't have kids. It's very, very abusable, which again doesn't necessarily mean that ethically it's wrong or anything like that, but it's something to be very, very aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I'm glad you went on to talk about the Uyghurs, you did pronounce it right, in China and the mass genocide that's apparently going on over there and their use of eugenics over there. Because there is a massive example of eugenics in practice in history. And that's just across the channel over in Germany. Obviously, the Nazis were in control from 1933 until 1945 and the fall of the Third Reich. But during that time, they had a massive program of eugenics going on, trying to make Germany an Aryan utopia, trying to make the world an Aryan utopia. And eugenics was used there. They had breeding centers for Aryan people there. So it doesn't take much change to see how something like that could be implemented into a society like ours. Pierre, did you have anything to say?
Yeah, with that, there's the problem, though, that you can't let it go privately. With Amber's point of only the rich being able to get it, it has to be governmentally controlled if everyone's going to get it fairly, or more fairly than if it's just private. And with your point of eugenics, there's also a point of, will certain people who we don't know the potential of, will they be killed? Like, for example, Stephen Hawking, he revolutionized a lot of parts of physics, but if he had been found out before when he was a baby that he was going to have his problem, then will he have been terminated and not brought all of this revolutionary stuff into our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to think about how different our society today or in the future would be if certain people weren't here because of genetic engineering. But that's a point I think we'll get onto in a second. Ian, did you have anything to add to the negatives?
I think from a artistic point of view, when it comes to people as a whole, it ruins the uniqueness of a child. And I think that is a damn shame, frankly, because, you can, expanding on Pierre's point, you never know the potential of someone. And if you spoil that potential before you even have a chance of seeing it happen, then you almost might as well not be human at all.
Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point talking about the uniqueness of people, because obviously if you're aiming towards a certain DNA strain being in everyone or a certain DNA strain not being in everyone, what else are you going to change about that person? Where does it stop? It's definitely something to think about. It's some good food for thought. Thank you for bringing that up, Ian. Amber, did you have anything to say?
So another disadvantage about designer babies is perhaps the stigma that it could contribute to surrounding people with disabilities. So if we say that we're going to genetically modify babies, that they won't have certain disabilities, which still people can still live with, and might sort of say to people who do have these disabilities, and are living perfectly happy lives that they shouldn't really exist in the first place, that sort of thing. So I think we do need to be careful how we approach the whole argument about eliminating those in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a massive ethical argument, which is the questions about the existence of disabled people in our modern society. Massive issue. Because once you start talking about that, it gets very offensive very quickly. Because going back to the point made earlier about Stephen Hawking, you have no idea what the potential of someone may be. Guy?
Yeah, so kind of on that point, and also on Ian's point earlier about like people, kind of the artistic nature of humanity and the concern that it might become homogenized. So earlier we were talking about from an evolutionary point of view that it might be better, the idea of like quote unquote accelerating evolution, trying to get things that are better. But like when we're talking about stuff like disability, the reason that it can get so offensive so quickly is because disability on the whole is in a way relative. So like things that are judged to be disabilities in our society would not be judged as disabilities in other societies. So if you have a completely hypothetical society where everyone is deaf from birth, being able to hear in a society where it's fabricated from everybody being deaf from birth, being able to hear might actually be classified as a disability. Because, you know, there'd be sounds that would, like, I don't think it's exactly a hot take that things that are disabilities are making people's life worse. But at the same time, the idea that we should try and accelerate evolution, and you know, it's better because we can get this thing quicker. Evolution as a whole, there's a reason that people are genetic outliers. We didn't just suddenly get the ability to walk on 2 feet because suddenly everyone decided that. Like, there are genetic outliers who could do that ages ago, and then bam, that's become an incredibly important thing. Same with having fingers and thumbs, which you can like articulate with. So in terms of like evolution as a whole, if you simply see a mutant gene and go, that's bad, we need to get rid of that, not only would you be setting evolution in a way potentially further back, but also similarly kind of on the evolution point Amber made about like we don't know what the future holds. If, let's say, we make humanity perfect for the society we're in today, we need either our society to stay the same forever, which will just practically never happen due to social reasons, but also environmental reasons. If something massive happens which changes the environment on a fundamental level, and we've spent decades homogenizing our genetics such that there are no mutations, the human race would just end. Meanwhile, from a practical point of view, there could be specific things which give like advantages in terms of surviving in a new and different world, however many hundreds of years in the future, which we might just be nipping in the bud by going, yeah, not that. Oh, but I want him to be smart, so we can get a good job in an office or something. Because if you have the whole population be office smart, suddenly you lose the whole art sector. It's the equivalent of going, farming wheat, specifically in this country, is the most efficient country to do it, so this country is going to be the only one that does it. And it's like, guys, there's a flood. The world has no food. If you risk putting too many eggs in one basket when society as a whole, and the human race ideally, is an ever-changing thing, admittedly at a slow speed.
There are 2 points I wanted to add to that quickly. Number one, I wanted to go back to your point about cultural interpretations of what is good. So there is actually an example of this that I can think of, and that is obesity, as a matter of fact. The Western world in Western Europe and Northern America can recognize that there are certain downsides to that, that there are health side effects with being obese. And so we try to counter that and try and stop people from being obese. Whereas, if you look at certain African societies, they will, in fact, or the men will worship the obese women and try and marry them as opposed to skinny women, because obesity shows that you can afford food and therefore gives off an eminence of wealth. So that, I think, is an important point to make. It is relative to where you are. And my second point on your argument, Guy, is going on to the same point that you were trying to make of trying to make everyone's DNA the same. On the idea of disease, if there is a disease that affects people with this genome that everyone has, and they are very susceptible to it, much like the pandemic that is going on at the moment, the pandemic isn't spreading very quickly relatively to the human population at the moment. But if we all had the same DNA, there's nothing to say a virus couldn't spread through us all and kill us all off within a month. Pierre.
If with what Guy was saying, where if you make everyone have the same DNA or same sort of smarts and stuff, then you could argue again that certain jobs and things people would maybe feel more redundant, where the fact that some people are more intelligent than others and so are doing more sort of research-based things, and then other people will be like, well, I could also be doing that, so why would I do a much more basic job? So we'll lose a lot of fundamental jobs and other basic things that we take for granted in our current society.
Yeah, you make a very good point there, Pierre. Thank you. Okay, I think we should move on to the final topic of the day now. So, what do you guys think the future holds for designer babies? This could be ethically, scientifically, or in any way you see fit, really. Ian, yes.
I personally believe that further study is needed. And also, we need to fix problems that people are born with before we can prevent them before birth. So, for example, disabilities, if they can be cured, we should find the cure for them no matter what before we decide, yes, we can get rid of that from future babies. Reason being, it means that the people that have already been born with the disabilities are no longer put to a disadvantage. And we need safer treatment for just all of it. And overall, I think we just need a better understanding of how genes work. And I think we've already got quite a good idea anyway, but I think we need to understand them a lot better because we don't know about what gene editing might do to future babies, or if a gene-edited baby gives birth to another gene-edited baby, will there be health implications because it's been done manually? We just will not know. And I think until we've got a better understanding of how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together, we need to really take baby steps. And I think the ideas that most people have about it are not baby steps in the slightest. I think they are huge strides and possibly into territory that we will never begin to comprehend.
Yeah, absolutely. The angle of looking into the future obviously forgets the angle of looking at the present. The people that have disabilities at the moment, and you can't edit the embryo of someone that's already been born. Someone that is, for example, having Alzheimer's at the age of 80. They're not an embryo. They haven't been an embryo for 80, 81 years. So, Ian, you bring up a very good point there, I think. Pierre, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with Ian with the fact that I think way more money needs to be put into research about genetic editing as a whole, and especially with what Guy touched on about CRISPR, where it can actually edit genes not just of embryos, but it can also edit genes of living people. So in this way, we could do, as Ian was saying, and balance out society where you don't have the gap of some people are going to have Alzheimer's and some people aren't. So I think this is an absolute essential because we want to wipe out there's more essential diseases such as Alzheimer's and things like that, because everyone can agree, or most people can agree, that those ones are not pleasant and they don't benefit anyone in any way.
I completely agree with you. I think it is something that definitely needs to be invested in for everyone, not just a specific few people, as it may end up getting researched for. Amber, did you have anything to say?
I think that no matter how widespread or legal it becomes, it is always going to remain a very controversial topic, as there's always the arguments about people living with certain disorders anyway and their lives at the moment. And then also I think that another point to add on to that is the process of it becoming more widespread, because with all the research going in, at some point we're almost certainly going to have a trial which is going to lead to a really, really awful outcome. So it could be that a baby could be born after it was genetically engineered and it's got some awful disabilities, its quality of life is really, really poor, and that will definitely contribute to a negative stigma surrounding designer babies.
Yeah, I agree with you, Amber. When we talk about scientific advancements and experiments, there are always successes and failures. But when the failures could cost the life of a human child, that matter is of grave importance for not only the child, but their parents, for the people that know them, and for the doctors as well. It's a massive ethical issue whether testing on human embryos and children is actually acceptable in our modern society. Guy?
Well, I just want to say, because, I think we can probably all agree that realistically, in terms of where we are on designer babies, if we look at other things that happened in the past, like the space race, that kind of thing, I think we're quite far from being on the cusp of it being an everyday thing, like the internet. But in a slightly reassuring way, there's already bodies set up. So like the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, the HFEA, that's been set up in the United Kingdom. That oversees, who can get certain treatments. For example, I'm pretty sure in terms of IVF, you need to clear it with the HFEA before you can get PGD, the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis that you talked about before, Jake. And that's not even like genetically modifying. That's simply just like giving somebody slightly more information on what their child will be like so they can then make a choice based on that. And I'd like to clarify, PGD was first used in 1989. Right? That was the first time it was ever used. But the HFEA was set up in 1990, just 1 year later than the first instance ever of an experimental idea being used. So we're already seeing things being set up to try and control it. And whether or not you see that as as a good thing, because it's not just something where some privatized scientist somewhere can decide to do something, or as a bad thing, because it means the government has more overall control over what, and let's be honest here, it's largely women's rights that's entangled in here, or like birth rights, because that's not always a woman problem, but you get my point. It's pretty much anybody who's ever going to be having birth is going to be part of a protected characteristic, be it being female, be it being transgender, whatever it is. And so there is always the concern that too much control from the state or too much control from privatized companies may threaten that, and there may be prejudice intertwined. But I think the fact that people are already setting up things just so quickly after a tiny, tiny, tiny leap in terms of how far we are is making a good stance that when it actually reaches a boiling point of being not mandatory, but like the most commonly done thing, that we will have institutes in place.
I think, moving on from your point, Guy, there was a case in China a couple of years back where a doctor was actually arrested and jailed for 3 years and fined something like 2 million yuan for helping parents to birth children who had had their DNA edited. So there is infrastructure in place very, very quickly after things like that happen to regulate it, to make sure that it doesn't go awry. I think that is an important point to make, to argue that it won't actually move at a very, very quick pace at all. Pierre, did you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think on that point, though, you have to sort of think about that we're talking about our society, whereas other societies that could be deemed less ethical, such as North Korea or something, if they do the research and we're not doing anything, or we're doing research at a much slower pace because we're thinking much more ethically and not treating our own people immediately and such, then we could become behind North Korea and they could be bringing things that just aren't right and are actually dangerous for the rest of our society. And with that as well, there's also the point of sort of it becoming a black market thing, or it becoming not governmentally managed because the government's management of it is so hardcore. And then you have the issue of no one being as much in control or being able to see what's truly happening. I think it has become more mainstream so that people are more comfortable with it and the research is more global. And so everyone knows what's going on with genetic engineering and designer babies as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think there are quite good parallels to draw between what's going on with genetic editing and designer babies at the moment and the world of abortion law. So if you look at America, obviously, certain states are starting to repeal the 1973 ruling of Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court, which legalized abortion, which is creating a massive increase in backstreet illegal abortions. If a society such as ours regulates something like genetic editing too much, that's not necessarily going to stop some people, much like how tax law doesn't stop people from evading it. It's swings and roundabouts, I think, when it comes to things like that. Ian, did you have anything to say?
It's been briefly mentioned already, but the whole idea is far too Western. I just wanted to expand on that point, that it's all so focused on what is Western intelligence that we're sort of getting carried away with the significance of genetic manipulation as a whole.
Well, obviously, as you know, science has become very Western-centric, especially since the fall of the Islamic Golden Age and the rise of colonialism, with all of the movement of money moving to Western Europe and North America. So the Western world pretty much leads scientifically. But does that necessarily mean they should lead ethically? I think that links in quite well. Thank you, Ian. Guy, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought up kind of, does that mean it leads ethically? Because obviously, while there are a lot of ethical issues in many things in the history and modern day of the UK, the US, pretty much every European country, in terms of the point made by Pierre about like North Korea, the idea that if we don't similarly violate ethical principles, then we will be behind countries which do. I understand the concept of pragmatism, but I think the idea that we should violate basic ethical principles because other states which are doing so may potentially become further like ahead than us and then may maybe pose a threat is kind of too consequentialist. You're already assuming that they will then become more of a threat simply because they're further ahead. And even if they do, I think as a country it's more important to hold up ethical principles rather than violate ethics to an extraordinary extent simply to have the potential leg up. Though obviously many Americans and almost every American president ever, apart from like the two good ones, would probably agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you there. Okay, does anyone else have anything to say on the future of designer babies?
So, genetic editing is sort of coming no matter what, I feel like. And I feel like a lot of people aren't prepared. And I feel like there needs to be more understanding and spread of intelligence to everyday society and everyone. Because I feel like I'm pretty sure if I asked most of the people I know that they have not heard of CRISPR. And this is one of the biggest discoveries in genetic engineering. And very few people have actually heard about it and heard what it's doing, what countries are using it. So it needs to be wider spread. Like the internet as well, when people finally heard about it, it was like, oh, it's here. It's already upon us and it's going to happen and it's going to revolutionize the world in all these ways. And people often as well don't believe it, but now it's here and everyone uses it every day. We're using it right now. And I think it needs to be more commonly thought about and argued and debated amongst people, just so that in society it becomes a more regular thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the purposes, at least I think, of this podcast specifically, is to try and fix that lack of knowledge on a certain subject in society. So I completely agree with you there, Pierre. I think there is a massive issue in terms of what people know about it, what people know about genetic engineering, what people know about how IVF works, or eugenics, or even things like genetically modified fruit and veg. It's all the same thing, pretty much. This is just that on a human level. Ian, one last point before we wrap up.
I was just going to finish it off with the fact that it's very Orwellian horror. It is probably the most dystopian idea that we've had in a long time. Just the idea of making people perfect. It's just not right at the end of the day. I think the ethics are just very, very low, and I think the people that are advocating genetic modification like this are frankly just ignoring whether or not it's good or bad, and that to me is, as I said, it's very dystopian. Frankly, it could be seen as pretty disgusting and vile, even from the standpoint of, oh, well, it's going to help kids become perfect and not disabled and, the like. But I think that, frankly, people will not use it for that. I think the people that can afford it will not use it for that. And unfortunately, I think that's just human nature. And I just think that's a damn shame, frankly.
I couldn't agree more with what Ian just said. It's just where human nature goes to the fact that we're not going to use it for benefit, but we're going to use it for short-term goals and what we want, rather than what its potential and what it could be used for.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the definition of perfection. And what a society sees as perfection will ultimately end up being the perfection that they portray on others. So it's really a slippery slope. If we don't learn enough about it, if we don't regulate ourselves, and if we don't stop when we should, we really run the risk of creating children with certain traits, certain characteristics, certain personality ideals, but also changing things like their gender, their hair color, the broadness of their shoulders, the length of their legs. It's almost amazing, but very, very scary to think what can come from something like genetic editing. And so, on that slightly less happy and slightly more dystopian note, I think that pretty much finishes our conversation for today's episode. So I want to thank you all for coming along and getting involved.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers, Jake.
Many thanks. Adios.
So, that wraps up today's episode of Fixing Ignorance. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation on designer babies and have taken at least one useful bit of information away from this. We will be recording and releasing 2 episodes a week during the COVID-19 pandemic at 3 PM on Mondays and Thursdays, and you can listen to them as they come out on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and all other major streaming platforms. I've been your host, Jake Bonetta. If you want, you can keep up to date with my political shenanigans and this podcast on Twitter, @JakeBonetta. See you next time, where we'll be looking at another big question with a new collection of voices. Thanks for listening.